"You clumsy, worthless woman. You touched my gown." The Sabbatini ballroom went deathly quiet. Champagne glasses stilled in midair, and 200 of Italy's most powerful and polished guests turned, almost in unison, toward the center of the gilded hall. Gianna Sabbatini stood there in a breathtaking sweep of royal blue silk, a diamond tiara catching every chandelier above her, her chest rising and falling with fury that looked almost rehearsed. At her feet, a plain, gray-haired maid in a black dress and white apron had stumbled slightly. The hem of Gianna's trailing gown caught briefly underfoot. It was an accident that lasted half a second. The slap that followed lasted a lifetime. The crack of it cut through the music, through the laughter, through the clinking of crystal, and a stunned silence swallowed the entire room whole. The maid did not cry. She did not flinch, did not beg, did not crumple the way Gianna clearly expected her to. She simply raised her black-gloved hand slowly to her cheek, turned to face the room, and in those dark, steady eyes lived something that not one person in that ballroom had the intelligence to recognize. Quiet, absolute, unhurried danger. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from right now, because tonight's story is the kind that will have your jaw on the floor and your heart racing before it is over. The elite guests whispered behind their hands. A few women shook their heads in mild pity, and Gianna smoothed her gown and turned away as though she had merely swatted at a fly. Nobody paid the maid another second of attention. Nobody noticed the way her jaw tightened beneath her white headscarf with the patient fury of a woman who had seen far worse in her life and survived every single one of those moments. Then the sound came from outside. It was not loud at first, just a deep mechanical rumble rolling through the stone driveway like distant thunder that had no intention of passing. Then the windows shook. One after another, sleek black armored vehicles, 6 of them in total, bearing the silver crest of the Morty Syndicate, rolled through the Sabbatini estate gates in a single, disciplined convoy. Arthur Sabbatini, host of the evening and a man who smiled at power the way dogs smile at strangers, straightened his lapels and leaned to his wife with a quiet, self-satisfied grin, assuming the Morty muscle had come to pay him tribute. He could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Armed men in dark suits flooded the ballroom doors, fanning out across the edges of the room in total silence. The conversation died completely. Then Marco Vital, the Morty Syndicate's underboss, a man whom 3 governments on 2 continents had failed to convict, walked through the center of that gleaming hall, past the Sabbatini hosts, past the senators and merchants and their jeweled wives, and came to a stop directly in front of the maid. He removed his hat. He bowed deeply at the waist. "Madame Morty," he said, "the perimeter is secured." The room stopped breathing. Slowly, with no rush and no theater, the old woman reached up and pulled the white headscarf from her silver-streaked hair, and what stood before that ballroom was not a maid at all. It never had been. What stood there, straight-backed and utterly composed with a red mark still fresh on her cheek, was the most feared woman in the Italian underworld. A single slap had just begun the end of everything the Sabbatini family had ever built. Now, to understand how a woman of that stature came to be standing in a servant's apron in her future daughter-in-law's kitchen, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. The name Valeria Morty was not a name one said carelessly in certain circles across Italy and beyond. In drawing rooms from Milan to Palermo, in the back offices of banks that never advertised their services, in the private dining rooms of men whose names never appeared in newspapers, that name was handled the way one handles a loaded firearm, with deliberate, measured respect. Since the passing of her husband, the formidable Edoardo Morty, nearly a decade prior, Valeria had assumed full, undisputed command of the Morty Syndicate, one of the oldest and wealthiest criminal organizations in southern Europe. Edoardo had built the empire brick by brick over 30 years, but it was Valeria who had quietly fortified its walls from the inside, plugging leaks, punishing betrayal, and expanding the family's legitimate business interests into real estate, private banking, and logistics. She did not hold meetings in warehouses. She held them in the oak-paneled study of her Tuscan estate, surrounded by fine art and better wine, and she never raised her voice, because she had never needed to. The Mordi estate sat behind high stone walls on a hillside outside Florence, where the cypress trees lined the long gravel path to the main house like a silent honor guard. Inside those walls, marble floors carried the weight of decades of consequence, and staff who had served the household for 20 years still addressed her as Madame and meant it fully. To those who did not know her, and many who claimed they did, Valeria Morti was imagined as a cold, silver-haired matriarch wrapped in severity and old money. They were only partially correct. She was elegant, yes, and ruthless when the situation called for it, but the people closest to her knew something the world had never been permitted to see. Valeria Morti loved her son with a ferocity that frightened even her. Don Rico Morti was 32 years old, broad-shouldered and sharp-featured, a man whose presence in any room carried the specific gravity of someone accustomed to being both obeyed and admired. He had his father's instincts in business, and his mother's eyes, dark and assessing and rarely still. From the outside, he appeared to be everything a syndicate heir should be, decisive, feared, and capable. But Valeria knew the crack running silently through that confident exterior. Rico had always been too trusting of beauty. He judged character the way civilians judged a meal, by its presentation, and Valeria had spent years waiting for that particular weakness to cost him something he could not afford to lose. Then Gina Sabbatini arrived. She came into Rico's orbit at a charity dinner in Rome, draped in ivory and grace, her voice soft enough to make strong men lean in when she spoke. The daughters of political families often had that particular talent, the ability to make a room feel warmer simply by occupying it, and Gina had mastered it the way other women mastered languages, deliberately and from a very young age. At dinners, she was witty without threatening the men around her. At private gatherings, she was warm, charitable, and appropriately humble. She knew exactly how much jewelry was too much, exactly how long to hold eye contact, and exactly which smile to deploy when a powerful man needed to feel like the most important person in the room. Mothers adored her manners. Men praised her grace. And Rico Morti, the son of the most suspicious woman in the Italian underworld, fell for every single note of that carefully composed performance without missing a single beat. But the one person Gina had never once managed to fool was the one person in the world who truly mattered. And that woman was currently standing in Gina's own kitchen, wearing an apron, bidding her time, and taking notes. There was a story told in certain corners of the underworld, mostly in hushed tones, and mostly by men who had survived long enough to tell it. About the night, a prominent Sicilian crime family made the grave miscalculation of attempting to seize control of the Morti shipping routes 3 months after Eduardo Morti's funeral. They had assumed, quite reasonably by their own logic, that a grieving widow would be in no condition to govern. Within 72 hours, their entire operation had been restructured, their leadership quietly replaced, and a single white envelope had been delivered to their new acting head containing nothing but a handwritten note that read, "Condolences on your recent losses." It was signed simply V. No threats, no demands, no follow-up conversation required. The message, like most of Valeria's messages, arrived already complete. That was 11 years ago, and in the time since, not one syndicate, cartel, or ambitious family on the European continent had tested that particular boundary again. The Morti Empire, on paper, was a collection of remarkably successful legitimate businesses, private logistics companies, agricultural exports, a small chain of luxury hotels along the Amalfi coast, and a private equity firm registered quietly in Luxembourg. Off paper, it was something considerably more complex, and Valeria managed both versions of it with the same unblinking focus. She woke each morning at 5:30, without an alarm, reviewed overnight communications with her coffee before the house staff had finished laying breakfast, and held her first briefing of the day by 7. She once told her late husband's lawyer, a cautious Roman named Ferretti who had served the family for 30 years, that power was 90% attention and 10% patience. And the violence, Ferretti had asked carefully. That, Valeria had replied, setting down her espresso cup, is what happens when someone wastes both of mine. Ferretti had not asked a follow-up question. For all of that, there was one subject on which Valeria Morty's legendary composure developed visible fractures, and that subject was her son. Rico had been born during the hardest years of the syndicate's growth, when Eduardo was fighting battles on 3 fronts, and their name was still being tested in rooms where it now commanded silence. Valeria had raised the boy largely on her own during those years, and she had done it the way she did everything, with precision, without sentimentality, and with an expectation of excellence that Rico had largely met. He had grown into a man the organization respected. He ran his operations cleanly, commanded loyalty without cruelty, and had the rare quality among men in his position of knowing when to speak, and when to simply let his presence make the argument for him. Those qualities came directly from his mother, and she knew it, even if she rarely said it aloud. What she also knew, and what kept her awake on nights when she permitted herself the vulnerability of sleeplessness, was that Eduardo's warmth had gone into Rico as well. The open-handedness, the willingness to believe in people, the dangerous and deeply human habit of seeing the best in a room before scanning it for the worst. Eduardo had survived that quality because Valeria had always been standing beside him, doing the scanning on his behalf. Rico had no such person beside him. And that absence was the one gap in the Morty fortress that Valeria had never fully managed to close. She had tried conversations, measured and deliberate ones, in which she raised concerns carefully and waited for him to engage with them. Those rarely ended well. "You see a threat in every person who gets close to me," Rico had told her once, standing at the window of her study with his back turned, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had rehearsed this argument long before delivering it. "I see patterns," Valeria had replied. "You see enemies," he had said. "Rico, there is sometimes very little difference between the two." He had left the room shortly after, and they had not spoken again for 11 days. That was the wound neither of them discussed openly, and both of them felt constantly, the deep, quiet rupture between a mother who loved by protecting and a son who experienced that protection as a cage. Valeria understood the dynamic clearly enough to name it, and understanding it had done almost nothing to resolve it. She could dismantle a rival syndicate in 3 days, restructure an empire across 4 countries, and negotiate terms that made seasoned men nervous. But she had never once found the precise language required to cross the 12 feet of floor between herself and her son without something breaking in the air between them. So when Rico had appeared in her study 4 months ago, his face carrying that particular brightness she had not seen since he was a boy, and said the words, "Mama, I want you to meet someone," Valeria had felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was a genuine, startling flicker of hope. The second was the cold instinct of a woman who had spent 4 decades reading rooms, which told her, before he had even spoken the name, that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. She had said nothing that evening. She had smiled, asked careful questions, poured the wine, and listened to her son speak about Gianna Sabbatini with the full and unguarded devotion of a man who had already made his decision and was only now informing his mother of it. And in the silence of her bedroom that same night, long after Rico had gone, Valeria sat at her dressing table and looked at her own reflection for a long, quiet moment. Then she picked up her phone and made a single call. "Find out everything," she said. "Everything about who?" came the reply. "The Sabbatini family," she said, "and do it quietly." She ended the call, set the phone down, and did not sleep at all. The intelligence report on the Sabbatini family arrived on Valeria's desk 4 days after she made the call, and it told her two things immediately. The first was that the family was considerably wealthier on paper than their actual liquid assets suggested, which meant someone had been managing appearances for a very long time. The second was that Arthur Sabbatini, Gianna's father, had spent the better part of a decade cultivating political relationships that served exactly one purpose: protecting people who needed protection from consequences they had earned. Valeria had read the report once, folded it, locked it in the drawer beneath her desk, and said nothing to Rico. Not yet. She needed to see the girl for herself first. She did not have to wait long. Rico had arranged a family dinner at the estate 3 weeks after their initial conversation, and he had arrived with Gianna on his arm, looking like a man who had solved a problem he had not even known he was carrying. Gianna had been everything the report had not bothered to mention, polished in a way that felt almost architectural, as though every element of her presentation had been load-bearing. Her dress was understated enough to suggest she did not need to try, her jewelry minimal enough to communicate good breeding, and her first words to Valeria had been delivered with a warmth so well calibrated it almost sounded genuine. "Madame Morty," she had said, taking Valeria's hand in both of hers and holding it briefly. "Rico speaks of you constantly. I have been looking forward to this evening more than I can say." Valeria had smiled back with precisely the same energy. "As have I, my dear," she had replied. And the dinner had been, by any observable measure, a success. Gianna complimented the estate without gushing, asked intelligent questions about the family's agricultural exports without prying, laughed at Rico's stories at exactly the right moments, and deferred to Valeria twice during conversation in the particular way that said, "I respect your authority here," without ever appearing submissive. Rico had watched his mother across the table with barely concealed hope in his eyes, the expression of a son who wants his two worlds to simply agree to coexist, and Valeria had given him nothing to read, which she suspected frustrated him more than an outright objection would have. After dinner, while Rico stepped away to take a call, Valeria and Gianna had sat together briefly in the drawing room, and it was there, in the space of approximately 4 minutes, that the performance had developed its first small, visible seam. Marta, the estate's youngest housegirl, had come in to clear the coffee tray. She was 17, quiet, and had been with the household for less than a year. The tray caught slightly on the table edge as she lifted it, and a single teaspoon clinked to the floor. Marta had gone red to the ears, murmured an apology, and bent to retrieve it. Gianna had not said a word, but she had looked at the girl. It was only a glance, half a second at most, and then her attention returned to Valeria with her smile re-engaged and perfectly intact. But Valeria had seen what lived in that half-second. It was not irritation exactly, and it was not contempt in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, and, in Valeria's experience, considerably more telling. It was indifference, the specific brand of indifference that comes not from distraction, but from a deeply held belief that certain people simply do not register as fully real. Valeria filed it away without expression and changed the subject smoothly. Over the weeks that followed, Rico moved through his days with a lightness his mother had not seen in years, and she would have been lying to herself if she claimed that part of her did not welcome it. He visited the estate more frequently, called more often, and twice arrived with flowers for no occasion at all, which had surprised the house staff enough that the head cook had mentioned it to Valeria with genuine bewilderment. "He brought tulips, madame," the woman had reported, as though reporting a mild weather anomaly. "So I saw," Valeria had replied. He was happy, genuinely and visibly happy, and that happiness had a name, and that name was Gianna. But Valeria began paying closer attention. At a lunch in the city, hosted by a mutual acquaintance, she watched Gianna wave away a parking attendant who had greeted her warmly, as though the man had not spoken at all. At a private gallery opening Rico had arranged, she observed Gianna speak directly over the head of a caterer who had attempted to offer her a menu card, her gaze sliding past the woman without acknowledgement. Small things, individually, each one dismissible and easily explained. But patterns, Valeria had always believed, were merely small things that had agreed on a direction. One evening, after Rico had stayed late at the estate and Gianna had excused herself early, Valeria had sat across from her son over the last of a bottle of red wine and chosen her words with the care of someone diffusing something. "She is very polished," Valeria said. "She is," Rico agreed, with a smile that said he understood this was not entirely a compliment. "Does she treat people well?" Valeria asked. "All people, not just the ones who matter to her." Rico set his glass down and looked at his mother with an expression she recognized, because she had been the cause of it many times before. "Mama," he said quietly, "I am only asking Rico." "No," he said, and his voice was patient in the way that is close to tired. "You are only beginning." He kissed her on the cheek before he left, and Valeria sat alone with her wine and the quiet certainty that she was not wrong. She was never wrong about these things. She simply had not yet found the proof. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, which Valeria would later reflect was an entirely unremarkable day to have a conversation that changed everything. Rico had driven to the estate unannounced, which he rarely did, and the fact that he had not called ahead told Valeria, before he had even stepped through the door, that he had already decided how the conversation was going to go. He found her in the study reviewing end-of-quarter accounts, and he closed the door behind him with the deliberate quietness of a man working very hard to stay measured. "I need you to stop," he said. Valeria set her pen down and looked up. "You will need to be more specific," she said. "The questions you are asking about Gianna," he said. "The people you have had looking into her family, the comments you make at dinner that you dress up as concern." He paused. "Stop." Valeria leaned back in her chair and studied her son for a moment with the unhurried focus of someone reading a document they had expected to be complicated. "I asked questions," she said. "That is not interference, Rico. That is due diligence." "She is not a business acquisition," he said, his voice tightening at the edges. "No," Valeria agreed. "She is considerably more consequential than that." Rico walked to the window and stood with his back to her briefly, a habit he had developed in adolescence whenever he needed a moment to collect himself, and one he had never entirely grown out of. "You have done this with every woman I have ever brought near this family," he said finally, turning back around. "You find something. You always find something, or you invent it if you cannot find it." "I have never invented anything in my life," Valeria said, and the calmness in her voice was not a performance. "Then what is it?" he asked, spreading his hands. "Tell me specifically, what has she done? What has she said? Give me something concrete, Mama, because I am tired of living inside your suspicions." The silence between them held for a long moment. Valeria could have told him about the intelligence report and the Sabbatini finances, about the political arrangements that smelled of protection money, about the way Gianna's eyes had moved over Marta in the drawing room as though the girl were furniture that had been poorly placed. She could have laid all of it out on the desk between them and let him read it the way she had. But she knew Rico, knew the precise architecture of his loyalty once it was given, and she understood that presenting him with suspicion, however well supported, would only drive him further behind the wall he was already building. She needed proof he could not argue with. She needed him to see it for himself. "Nothing yet," she said simply. Rico looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, not entirely softening, but losing some of its edge. "She makes me better," he said quietly. "I know you do not see that, but she does." "I hope you're right," Valeria said. And she meant it, in the way that one means a thing while simultaneously preparing for the opposite to be true. Rico left an hour later, and the estate settled back into its usual quiet, and Valeria returned to her accounts. 3 days after that, the letter arrived. It came on Sabbatini family stationery, cream-colored and heavy. the kind of paper chosen specifically to communicate that the sender considered themselves important. The letter, signed by Arthur Sabbatini himself, was addressed to Valeria directly and written in the formal, courteous language of a man who had spent years in political circles, learning to wrap demands in the clothing of invitations. It informed her that in preparation for the forthcoming announcement of Rico and Gianna's engagement, the Sabbatini family wished to host a premarital gathering at their estate the following month, a private gala for close associates and family, at which a binding asset coordination agreement between the two families would be presented for review and signature. Her attendance, the letter noted warmly, was essential. Valeria read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk and sat very still for approximately 40 seconds, which was, for her, a considerable amount of time to spend doing nothing at all. An asset coordination agreement was not a standard pre-wedding courtesy. It was a legal instrument. It was the kind of document that, depending on how it was structured, could give one family significant reach into the financial operations of another. And it was the kind of document that a family with Arthur Sabbatini's particular set of political connections would know exactly how to construct in their own favor. They were not inviting her to a celebration. They were inviting her to a signing. And they had done it with enough formality and enough advance notice that declining would constitute an open insult, forcing her either to appear or to declare herself an obstacle to her own son's happiness. It was, she had to admit, a reasonably well-designed trap. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a brief, gracious reply confirming her attendance. Then she sat back and thought carefully for a long time, and the idea, when it arrived, came with the quiet completeness of something that had always been inevitable. She would attend the Sabbatini gala, certainly. But she would not be arriving as Madame Valeria Morty of the Morty Syndicate, dressed in silk with a driver and 2 security men at her shoulder. She would arrive through the service entrance. She would wear an apron. She would carry a tray. And she would watch the Sabbatini family move through their own home when they believed no one worth impressing was present. Because that, she had always known, was when people showed you exactly who they were. Valeria had once negotiated a peace agreement between 2 warring factions in a basement in Naples, while a man with a gun stood 4 feet behind her chair. She had not blinked then. She did not blink now, standing in front of her dressing mirror at 5 in the morning, pulling a plain white headscarf over her silver hair and studying the result with the same critical attention she gave to everything. The woman looking back at her wore a black dress, a white apron and flat shoes, and looked entirely unremarkable, which was precisely the point. Marco had arranged her placement through a staffing agency that supplied temporary help to large private events across Tuscany, and the Sabbatini estate, in preparation for the gala, had taken on 14 additional staff members without bothering to look closely at any of them. Wealth, Valeria had observed over many decades, made people careless about who was standing in their rooms. She arrived at the service entrance at 7:15 in the morning, a full 2 hours before the other temporary staff, carrying nothing but a small canvas bag and the patience of a woman who had learned to treat waiting as a weapon. The service entrance was at the rear of the estate, accessible through a narrow stone path that ran alongside the main wall, and it smelled of cigarette smoke and overworked kitchen equipment before she had even reached the door. She knocked once. The door swung open, and a woman filled the frame with the specific energy of someone who had been irritated since before sunrise and intended to remain so. She was the head housekeeper, a stout, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Donna Secchi, and she looked Valeria up and down with the slow, dismissive assessment of a person who had long since decided that all temporary staff were a problem that had not yet fully revealed itself. "You are early," Donna said, not as a compliment. "I wanted to be prepared," Valeria replied pleasantly. "I did not ask what you wanted," Donna said, stepping aside to let her through. "I have enough of those already. What I need is someone who does exactly what they are told without asking questions, breaking things, or crying. Can you manage that?" I will do my best, Valeria said. Donna gave her a look that suggested she considered this an insufficient guarantee, then turned and walked briskly down a narrow corridor without checking whether Valeria was following. She was, of course, following, and as she walked, she looked. The service corridor was a different world from the gilded rooms she had glimpsed through windows as she came around the side of the building. The walls here were bare plaster, the floor was worn stone, and the lighting was the cheerless fluorescent kind that made everyone in it look slightly unwell. What struck Valeria, though, was not the austerity of the space. It was the silence of the people already working inside it. 3 young women stood at a preparation table in the kitchen, their heads down, their movements quick and economical in the manner of people who had learned that drawing attention to themselves led to nothing good. A boy of perhaps 19 was restocking shelves along the far wall, and when Donna swept through the kitchen door, his shoulders rose almost imperceptibly, the way a person braces for cold water. Nobody greeted Donna. Nobody made eye contact with her. The room simply adjusted its posture and carried on. You will be on drink service for the main hall from 5 o'clock this evening, Donna told Valeria, pointing to a set of folded uniforms on the counter. Before that, you will assist in the preparation kitchen, polish the serving ware, and restock the East Corridor side tables. You will not speak to the guests unless spoken to. You will not linger. You will not be visible. Understood, Valeria said. Donna looked at her for a half-second longer than necessary, as though something about Valeria's composure was mildly irritating in a way she could not name. Then she moved on. The morning passed, and Valeria worked quietly alongside the other staff, and by midday she had learned more about the Sabbatini household than 3 days of intelligence reports had managed to provide. She learned it not from documents, but from the way the permanent staff carried themselves, from the particular flinch that preceded footsteps on the main staircase, from the careful way a kitchen girl named Sophia, who could not have been older than 17, stepped out of the path of anyone in formal clothing, as though occupying their space was a punishable offense. During a brief lull in the afternoon, Valeria stood beside Sophia at the polishing station and worked quietly for a few minutes before speaking. "How long have you worked here?" she asked. Sophia glanced up briefly, then back down at the silverware in her hands. 8 months, she said. "Is it always like this?" Valeria asked. Sophia did not answer immediately, and when she did not look up. "It is better when the family is away," she said simply. That was all she said, and Valeria did not push further, but she held those 7 words carefully for the rest of the afternoon, turning them over the way one turns over a stone to examine what has been living underneath it. By the time the gala guests began to arrive at 5, and the ballroom filled with the sound of music and expensive conversation, Valeria had a very clear picture of the Sabbatini estate's internal reality. It was a house that ran on fear. Not the dramatic, operatic kind that she herself occasionally employed in the service of larger purposes, but the grinding, daily, low-level kind, the kind that accumulated quietly in people over months and years and left marks that did not show on the surface. Valeria had built an empire on the principle that loyalty given freely was worth 20 times the loyalty extracted by force. The Sabbatini family, it appeared, had never once considered that distinction. She adjusted her headscarf, picked up her tray, and walked into the ballroom. The ballroom was exactly the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel that they had arrived somewhere, tall ceilings, warm chandelier light, the low murmur of important conversations being conducted at a volume that made them sound effortlessly casual. Valeria moved through it without pause, tray level, expression neutral, completely invisible in the way that only people in service uniforms ever truly are at events like this. She had always found that particular social phenomenon instructive. A woman could walk through a room full of the most perceptive, most politically astute people in the country, and provided she was carrying a drinks tray, not one of them would look at her face. It was, she reflected, an almost perfect intelligence-gathering condition. She was refilling glasses along the east side of the room when she heard Gianna's voice coming from behind the partially open door of the anteroom adjacent to the main hall, the small, mirrored sitting room that the family used as a staging area before formal entrances. Valeria did not stop walking. She simply adjusted her route slightly and positioned herself at the service table nearest to that door, close enough to work quietly and observe through the narrow gap without drawing any attention. What she saw through that gap stopped something cold and still inside her chest. Gianna was standing before the full-length mirror in the anteroom, and she was practicing. Not her posture, not her appearance, both of which were already immaculate. She was practicing her expressions. She ran through them with the focused efficiency of an actress preparing for a performance, and perhaps that comparison was unkind to actresses. First came modest surprise, a slight widening of the eyes, one hand rising briefly to the collarbone, the lips parting just enough to suggest she had been genuinely caught off guard by something wonderful. Then came gentle concern, the brow softening, the head tilting fractionally, the eyes warming in a way that, had Valeria not been watching her rehearse it 30 seconds earlier, she might almost have believed. Then came devoted admiration, reserved clearly for Rico, the full smile arriving slowly, the gaze lifting as though encountering something that moved her deeply every single time. She ran through the sequence twice. The second time was noticeably cleaner than the first. Standing slightly behind her in the mirror's reflection, holding a small evening bag and watching with visible approval, was Evelyn Sabbatini, Gianna's mother, a lean, composed woman in burgundy silk whose smile never quite reached the level of her eyes regardless of the occasion. "Better," Evelyn said quietly. "Softer on the concern. He responds to warmth, not worry." "I know how he responds," Gianna said, turning away from the mirror and smoothing the front of her royal blue gown. "Then remember it when his mother is in the room," Evelyn said. "That woman will be watching everything." Gianna made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Let her watch," she said. "By the time she finds anything worth seeing, it will already be too late to matter." Evelyn said nothing to that, which Valeria had come to understand in the last 12 hours, was how the Sabbatini family expressed agreement. Valeria set down a glass on the service table with steady hands, straightened her tray, and returned to the ballroom floor. She was not angry. Anger, in her experience, was a fire that consumed the person carrying it long before it reached its intended target. What she felt instead was something colder and considerably more useful, the quiet, absolute settling of a suspicion into a certainty. She worked the room for another 40 minutes, and then it happened. The guests had thickened near the entrance as more arrivals came through, and the floor space along the south side of the ballroom had narrowed considerably. Valeria was navigating toward the bar station with an empty tray when the crowd shifted, and the trailing hem of Gianna's gown, which swept nearly a full foot behind her on the polished floor, caught briefly beneath Valeria's flat shoe. It was nothing. Half a step's worth of contact, a brush so minor that most people would not have registered it at all. Gianna registered it immediately. She spun around with a speed that suggested she had been coiled for exactly this kind of provocation, and her eyes, those carefully rehearsed warm eyes, were gone entirely, replaced by something flat and furious. "You filthy, clumsy woman," she hissed, her voice pitched low but carrying every gram of its venom. "You touched my gown." "I apologize, miss," Valeria said quietly. She was not certain what Gianna saw in her face in that moment, whether it was the apology or the complete absence of fear behind it, but something in it seemed to snap the last thread of whatever restraint Gianna kept for public settings. Her hand came up and across in a single motion, and the slap landed with a sharp, clean crack that cut through the nearest conversations like a blade through paper. The music did not stop, but the people nearest to them did. Valeria did not stumble. She absorbed the impact with the stillness of a woman who had taken far worse and charged far higher prices for it, And then she turned her face slowly back to its original position and looked at Gianna with an expression that contained no anger, no tears, and no fear whatsoever. She raised her black-gloved hand calmly and touched her cheek once. Then she adjusted the fit of the glove at her wrist, smoothed her apron, and picked up her tray. She said nothing. She did not need to. The debt had been registered in the only ledger that mattered, the one Valeria kept internally, the one that had never once recorded a balance that went uncollected. She turned and walked back toward the bar station, and behind her, Gianna straightened her gown and smiled at a nearby guest as though nothing of any consequence had occurred. She was still smiling when the account started collecting interest. Rico Morty arrived at the Sabbatini estate at 7:30, and the room knew it before anyone announced him. It was not the cut of his dark suit, though that was excellent, and it was not the two quiet, broad-shouldered men who entered a few seconds ahead of him and took up positions near the door without making a production of it. It was simply the way he moved through a room, unhurried and entirely certain of his place within it, the particular walk of a man who had never once needed to wonder whether he was welcome somewhere. He was 32 years old and looked like the kind of trouble that came gift-wrapped, and every person in that ballroom who had any understanding of the name he carried gave him exactly the amount of space and attention that name deserved. Arthur Sabbatini crossed the room to greet him with the wide, slightly overeager smile of a man who understood very clearly which side of a relationship held the leverage. "Don Morty," he said warmly, extending both hands. "We are honored." "Arthur," Rico replied, shaking his hand with the easy confidence of someone who accepted honor as a default condition rather than an occasion. The pleasantries were brief, as they always were with Rico. His eyes were already moving past Arthur toward the far side of the ballroom, and when they found what they were looking for, the composed, measured expression he carried in professional settings softened in a way that was small but entirely visible to anyone paying close attention. Gianna had seen him enter. Of course she had. Valeria, stationed at the drinks table along the west wall with a fresh tray, watched her future daughter-in-law execute the reunion with the smooth, unhesitating confidence of someone running a routine they had rehearsed to the point of instinct. Gianna crossed the floor toward Rico with just enough restraint to suggest she was containing a greater happiness, her smile arriving in stages, warm and then warmer, her hand reaching for his arm as though drawn there by something involuntary. "You are late," she said, with the particular tone that makes lateness sound like an endearment. "I am precisely on time," Rico replied, and bent to kiss her cheek. "You simply arrived early because you could not wait." Gianna laughed, and it was a good laugh, light and unforced, the kind that made the people nearest to them smile without knowing why. "He is not wrong," Evelyn Sabbatini remarked from 2 steps behind her daughter, appearing at precisely the right moment with precisely the right expression to complete the picture of a warm, welcoming family receiving the man they had chosen for their child. It was, Valeria thought, watching from her position across the room, a genuinely impressive piece of choreography. She would have admired it professionally, had the mark not been her son. For the next 40 minutes, Gianna conducted herself with the focused precision of someone who understood that this evening was a performance with consequences, and she did not miss a single note. She drew Rico's attention toward the right people, steered him away from the wrong conversations, laughed at his remarks in front of guests who needed to see them as a unit, and touched his arm at carefully chosen intervals in the way that staked a claim without appearing to. Rico, for his part, moved through it all with that open, unguarded brightness that Valeria had been worrying about for months. He was happy here. Visibly, completely, dangerously happy. And then he turned, as the current of movement through the ballroom shifted, and he was facing the drinks table. He was facing her. Valeria stood no more than 8 feet away, tray in hand, white headscarf in place, a faint but definite mark still present on her left cheek from the hour before. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Rico's gaze passed across her face with the brief polite non-acknowledgement that guests at these events extended to serving staff, a glance that registered a human presence without engaging with it, and then moved on to the tray of champagne glasses she was holding. He reached out and took a glass without looking at her again. "Thank you," he said pleasantly, to the space she occupied. And then Gianna said his name from 2 feet to his left, and he turned back toward her, and Valeria watched her son walk away through a ballroom full of people, entirely unaware that the woman he had just taken a drink from was the one person in the world who loved him without condition or agenda. She stood very still for a moment. The mark on her cheek had begun to ache in the dull, persistent way that bruises do when adrenaline stops holding them back, and the weight of the tray was more familiar now than it had been at 5 o'clock. Enrico was laughing at something Gianna had said with his whole face, the way he used to laugh as a boy at the dinner table before everything became complicated between them. She had told herself, before coming here, that she was on an intelligence operation, that this was strategy, not emotion, that she was a woman who had run a criminal empire for 11 years through grief and threat and betrayal, and had never once allowed sentiment to compromise her judgment. All of that remained true. And yet, "Are you all right?" a quiet voice said beside her. It was Sophia, the young kitchen girl from the morning, who had come to collect empty glasses and was looking at Valeria with the cautious concern of someone who had learned to offer kindness in very small, deniable quantities. "Yes," Valeria said after a moment. She straightened her grip on the tray and looked across the room one more time at her son, laughing in the light, surrounded by people who were planning to ruin him. "I am perfectly all right," she said. She meant it as a reassurance. It came out sounding like a decision. It was shortly after 9 o'clock when Valeria noticed the shift. The kind of shift that most people in a room full of wine and conversation would never catch. A subtle tightening of the Sabbatini family's social formation. The way Arthur and Evelyn began maneuvering through the crowd with just enough purpose to suggest they were heading somewhere specific, without wanting anyone to notice they were doing it deliberately. Gianna followed 3 minutes later, excusing herself from Rico's side with a whispered word and a hand on his chest that she let linger a half-second longer than necessary, the kind of gesture designed to keep a man pleasantly occupied with the memory of it while she was gone. Rico smiled and turned back to his conversation. Valeria set her tray on the nearest surface, picked up a small restocking caddy from behind the bar station, and followed. The private study was located off the east corridor, 2 doors down from the main hall, and it was not a room that temporary staff had any business entering under normal circumstances. Fortunately, the side table immediately outside its door had been assigned to Valeria's restocking rounds since 4 o'clock that afternoon, and Donna Sekai had never thought to question why a temporary maid might be found working quietly in a corridor. The study door was not fully closed. It sat open by perhaps 4 inches, enough to let the low, deliberate voices inside travel clearly into the corridor, where Valeria worked with her back to the door. Her hands moving over the table service with the unhurried efficiency of a woman, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Arthur Sabbatini spoke first. "The agreement goes in front of him before the end of the evening," he said. "Ferraro has confirmed the language is airtight. Once it is signed, the asset coordination clause gives us co-signatory authority over 3 of the syndicate's primary accounts." "He will sign it," Evelyn said. "He has already told Gianna he has no objections." "He has not read it properly," Arthur said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "He has not." There was the quiet sound of a glass being set down on wood. "And the old woman," Arthur said. "The old woman." Valeria's hands did not pause on the table service. "She confirmed attendance 3 days ago," Gianna said. "She will be at the formal signing dinner next month." "That is too long," Arthur said. "Once she has reviewed the agreement, she will find the clause. We both know that." "She will not review it before the wedding," Gianna said, with the flat certainty of someone who had thought this through carefully and arrived at a conclusion they found satisfactory. Rico will make sure of that. He has spent months keeping the two of them at arm's length. He considers it a point of independence. I have made sure he continues to consider it that. A brief silence. And after the wedding, Evelyn asked. Gianna's voice, when it came, had shed every trace of the warmth Valeria had watched her construct and deploy all evening with such practiced care. What remained beneath it was something considerably simpler and considerably colder. There is a compound, she said, slow-acting, clinically untraceable at standard autopsy. Administered in small, consistent doses over 6 to 8 weeks, it presents as cardiac deterioration in women her age. Natural causes, professionally documented, entirely unremarkable. The corridor was completely quiet. Where did you source it? Arthur asked. Through the same channel that handled Senator Luca's situation 2 years ago, Gianna said. It is reliable. Evelyn made a small sound of consideration. The son, she asked. Rico will be grieving, Gianna said. A grieving man with legal vulnerabilities in his business structure and a wife who holds co-signatory authority over his primary accounts is not in a strong position to ask difficult questions. By the time he understands what has happened to his organization, it will already belong to us on paper. Arthur said something then that Valeria did not hear, because the sound of her own pulse had briefly become the loudest thing in the corridor. She stood at that side table for another full minute, moving items that did not need to be moved, keeping her breathing measured and her posture entirely unremarkable. She had spent 40 years in a world where threat was a daily condition and betrayal was an occupational hazard, and she had learned long ago that the most dangerous responses were the ones delivered in panic rather than clarity. So she did not panic. She catalogued. The Asset Coordination Agreement, designed to give the Sabbatini family legal reach into the syndicate's core, accounts the moment it was signed. Rico's legal vulnerabilities, which she had always known existed and had been carefully managing from a distance, now being mapped and positioned against him by people he trusted. And a compound, clinically untraceable, to be administered in small and consistent doses to a woman of her age over a period of 6 to 8 weeks. To her, they were going to poison her at a dinner table, fold her into a death certificate that said cardiac deterioration, and then dismantle her son's empire from the inside while he stood at a graveside. Valeria finished restocking the side table, picked up her caddy, and walked back toward the main hall with the calm, quiet step of a woman who had just decided, with complete certainty, exactly how this was going to end. The only question that remained was timing. And timing, she had always believed, was the one advantage that patience purchased absolutely. She walked back into the ballroom, picked up a full tray from the bar station, and served 3 more guests their champagne with a steady hand and a perfectly neutral expression. Across the room, Gianna returned to Rico's side, touched his arm and smiled up at him. Rico smiled back. Valeria watched them both, and for the first time since arriving at the Sabbatini estate, she permitted herself one thing she had not allowed all evening. She made a phone call. The phone call lasted 45 seconds. Valeria said 6 words, listened briefly, said 2 more, and ended it. Then she tucked the phone back into the pocket beneath her apron, straightened her headscarf, and returned her tray to the bar station for the last time that evening. She did not need to serve any more drinks. Everything that remained to be done tonight would be done without a tray. She took a position near the east wall of the ballroom, close enough to the room's center to see everything clearly and far enough from the main entrance that no one would think to look at her when the doors opened. She waited. The ballroom was at its fullest now, the noise of it warm and self-satisfied, 200 guests in their finest moving through the kind of evening that people like the Sabbatinis constructed specifically, so that other people would feel grateful to have been included in it. Arthur Sabbatini was holding court near the fireplace, a glass in one hand and a senator's ear in the other. Evelyn stood beside Gianna at the center of the room, both of them luminous and composed, performing a version of a family that Valeria now understood had never existed in any real sense. Rico was beside Gianna, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back, saying something that made the people around him laugh. He looked from across the room, like a man who had everything arranged exactly as he wanted it. The ground shifted at 10:17. It began as a sound more felt than heard, a deep vibration that moved through the floor before it reached the ears, the kind of resonance that very large, very heavy vehicles produce when they move in formation across stone. A few guests near the windows turned and looked out, more from curiosity than concern. What they saw was a line of black armored SUVs rolling through the Sabbatini estate, gates in single file, their headlights cutting clean white lines through the darkened grounds, each vehicle bearing the small silver crest of the Morty Syndicate on its front panel. 6 vehicles in total. Then behind them 2 more. Arthur Sabbatini noticed the commotion near the windows and excused himself from his conversation with the easy confidence of a man, accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He reached the window, looked out and smiled. He actually smiled. He turned to his wife across the room and gave her a small, satisfied nod, and Evelyn Sabbatini raised her chin half an inch in the manner of a woman receiving confirmation of something she had expected. The Morty muscle had arrived. As far as Arthur was concerned, this was the evening completing itself according to plan, the Syndicate's enforcers presenting themselves at the Sabbatini estate the way one power acknowledges another, and Arthur had spent long enough in political circles to know how to wear that kind of tribute on his face without making it look like pride. It looked very much like pride. He was still arranging his expression when the main doors of the ballroom opened. They came in quietly, which was somehow worse than if they had come in loudly. 12 men in dark suits entered through the main doors, while 4 more came through the side entrance, and they spread across the perimeter of the room in a smooth, unhurried movement that had the specific geometry of people who had done this in many rooms before and never once needed to rush. Nobody raised a weapon. Nobody spoke. They simply occupied the edges of the space and made it abundantly clear, through the sole authority of their presence, that the room's previous arrangement of power had been revised. The music stopped. Conversations did not so much end as evaporate, one by one, until the only sound in the ballroom was the faint settling of the building itself. Rico had gone very still, near the center of the room. His hand had dropped from Gianna's back, and his eyes were moving across the faces of the men along the walls with an expression that had shifted entirely out of the warmth of the evening and into something older and more alert. He did not understand what was happening, but he understood enough to know that whatever it was, it had not been arranged by him. Arthur Sabbatini stepped forward with his chin raised, performing authority for an audience that had stopped being his. "What is the meaning of this?" he said, loudly enough to reclaim the room. "This is a private function. If Don Morty has sent men, they can wait outside until—" He stopped. Marco Vital had entered through the main doors. Marco was not a physically imposing man in the dramatic sense. He was lean, gray at the temples, and moved with the quiet economy of someone who had never once needed size to communicate danger. Every person in that room who knew the name Morty knew Marco Vital's face, and several of them took a step backward with the involuntary honesty of people whose bodies had made a decision before their minds caught up. Marco walked through the center of the ballroom. He did not look at Arthur Sabbatini. He did not look at Gianna, or at Rico, or at any of the 200 guests now watching in absolute silence. He walked directly to the east wall, stopped in front of a plain woman in a black dress and white apron standing quietly beside the serving table, and removed his hat. He bowed deeply at the waist. "Madame Morty," he said, "the perimeter is secured, your instructions." The room held its breath. Slowly, without any theater or haste, the woman reached up and untied the white headscarf from her silver-streaked hair. She folded it once, set it on the table beside her, and turned to face the room. The mark on her cheek had deepened to a bruise over the course of the evening, and she wore it the way she wore everything, without apology and without explanation. Gianna Sabbatini's face did not simply fall. It came apart entirely, the careful architecture of the evening's performance dissolving feature by feature as the full weight of what was standing before her made itself understood. Arthur's glass slipped in his hand, though he caught it. Evelyn said nothing, which for once was not agreement. It was terror. Enrico Morty stood in the center of his future-in-law's ballroom, looking at his mother's bruised face and the folded white headscarf on the table beside her, and felt the specific, devastating vertigo of a man watching the ground he believed he was standing on reveal itself as air. "Rico," Valeria said quietly, and her voice in the silence of that room carried the way a single note carries in an empty cathedral. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The silence in the Sabbatini ballroom lasted perhaps 10 seconds. In the architecture of moments, 10 seconds is not very long at all. It was long enough. Valeria walked to the center of the room with the unhurried step of a woman moving through a space that had always belonged to her, regardless of whose name was on the deed, and she stood where the light was best and looked at the Sabbatini family the way a judge looks at a verdict they have already written. Arthur had recovered enough to attempt speech. "Madame Morty," he began, spreading his hands in a gesture that was trying very hard to be reasonable. "Whatever you may have heard this evening, I assure you that." "Arthur," Valeria said quietly. He stopped. "I did not hear anything this evening," she said. "I was present for it. There is a difference, and I would encourage you to understand that difference clearly before you decide what to say next." Arthur closed his mouth. She turned to Rico. He was standing 6 feet away, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, not anger, not shame exactly, but the particular devastation of a man watching two realities he had held separately collide into one, and finding that the collision had destroyed the version he had preferred. His eyes moved to the bruise on her cheek and stayed there. "Mama," he said, and his voice had lost every professional quality it normally carried. "I did not." "I know you did not," she said. "That is the part we will discuss later at length and in private." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and something passed between them that required no audience and no translation. Then she turned back to the room. What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. There were no raised voices, no threats delivered at volume, no theatrical declarations. Valeria did not need any of those things, and she had always considered them signs of preparation that had run out of patience. She spoke to Marco briefly in a voice too low for the room to follow, and Marco nodded once and stepped away to make 2 calls. The first call reached the office of the Deputy Minister of Justice, a man who had been in the Morty family's careful possession for 9 years and who understood. When Marco explained what had been overheard in the Sabbatini study that evening, that his most urgent priority before morning was to ensure that certain political protections previously extended to the Sabbatini family were no longer in effect. The second call reached the Morty Syndicate's financial division, and by 11 o'clock that night, the legal mechanisms required to freeze the Sabbatini family's primary assets had been set in motion through 3 separate channels, 2 of which were entirely legitimate and one of which was simply faster. Arthur Sabbatini received the first notification on his phone at 11:43, while standing in his own ballroom surrounded by guests who were very quietly and very quickly finding reasons to leave. He read the notification twice. Then he sat down heavily in the nearest chair and did not get up again for a considerable time. Gianna said nothing for most of it. She stood near the window with her arms folded across the royal blue silk of her gown and her face arranged in an expression that had given up performing anything at all. And when the Morty enforcers finally moved to escort the family to separate rooms for the formal documentation of the evening's events, she walked without resistance. The fight, it turned out, had been entirely contingent on the plan succeeding. Without the plan, there was nothing left to fight with. The wedding was cancelled before midnight, formally, and in writing, with copies directed to every legal and social entity that the engagement had involved. The Sabbatini family's political connections, stripped of their protection and suddenly aware of how comprehensively the ground had shifted, began a quiet but rapid rearrangement of their own associations, the particular kind of social vanishing act that powerful people perform when they need to be seen to have never been involved in something. Within 3 months, the family's financial situation had deteriorated past the point of management. Within 6, their social standing in the circles they had spent decades cultivating had reduced to the kind of polite silence that is, in its own way, far crueler than open hostility. The Sabbatini name, which had once opened doors across Tuscany and beyond, became the kind of name that was handled carefully. Not with respect. With caution. 1 year later, on a Tuesday morning in October, Valeria walked through the gardens of the Morty estate in the early light, her hands clasped behind her back, and her silver hair loose for once, the way she wore it only when she was not expecting to be observed. Beside her walked a young woman of 18, wearing a clean, well-fitted dress and carrying 2 small books under her arm, her posture considerably easier than it had been 12 months ago, when she had still flinched at footsteps. Sophia had been enrolled in a private secondary program in Florence since January, sponsored quietly and without announcement through one of the Morty family's charitable foundations. She was, by her tutor's account, exceptionally quick. Valeria had not been surprised. "How are the studies?" Valeria asked. "Better," Sophia said. "The mathematics was difficult at first. Now it is only occasionally humiliating, which feels like progress." Valeria smiled at that, a real one, the kind she distributed sparingly and therefore still meant something. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Sophia said. "You may," Valeria said. "That night at the estate," Sophia said carefully, "you already knew what they were planning when you walked back into the ballroom. You had heard everything." She paused. "Why did you keep serving drinks? Why did you wait?" Valeria considered the question as they walked. "Because patience is not weakness," she said, "and because a response delivered in the right moment carries 20 times the weight of one delivered in anger." She glanced at the young woman beside her. "Power is not the ability to hurt people, Sophia. Anyone with sufficient cruelty can manage that. Power is the ability to choose when, and whether, and how." Sophia absorbed this quietly. "And the mercy?" she asked. "You could have done considerably worse to them." "I did exactly enough," Valeria said simply. "No more. The lesson required delivery, not destruction." They walked a little further. Down at the estate's private docking facility. 3 miles from where they stood, Don Rico Morty was running a morning security rotation, alongside men who had worked the Morty docks for 20 years. Men who did not adjust their language or their expectations because of who his mother was. Men who had taught him more in 11 months about the actual weight of the organization he had inherited than a decade in a leadership title ever had. He had not complained. Not once. And Valeria, who knew everything that happened within the perimeter of her world, had noted that too. She stopped at the garden's edge, where the stone wall met the cypress line, and looked out over the valley below, the red-roofed farmhouses and the silver green of the olive trees, and the long, patient Tuscan light settling over all of it the way it always had and always would. "Real power," she said, more to the morning than to Sophia, "is what remains in a room after the fear has left it." She stood there a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and the gardens were quiet behind her, and the debt, every last note of it, had been fully and completely paid. And that, dear listeners, is the story of Madame Valeria Morty. A woman who traded her silk for an apron, walked through fire with her chin level, and reminded an entire room full of powerful people that the most dangerous person in any space is rarely the loudest one in it. She did not seek revenge for its own sake. She sought truth, and when the truth revealed itself in full, she let justice do what it was always going to do anyway. She simply helped it along. There is something worth carrying away from this story, and it is this. Character is not what people perform when the right eyes are watching. Character is what surfaces when people believe no one important is present. The Sabbatini family showed Valeria exactly who they were the moment they believed she was nobody. That mistake cost them everything. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never be cruel to the person carrying the tray. And never, under any circumstances, slap a woman wearing black gloves. If this story held you from the first word to the last, do something simple for us right now. Give this video a thumbs up, because it genuinely helps more people find stories worth their time. Share it with someone who loves a tale of patience, power, and perfectly delivered justice. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story, because we promise you, what is coming next is worth staying for. And drop a comment below telling us one thing. Who was your favorite character in this story, and what moment hit you the hardest? Until the next story, stay sharp, stay kind, and remember that real power always knows when to wait. Thank you for listening.